Intel's announcement that they were jumping into discrete GPUs likely didn't come as a surprise to many who had been following the industry closely for the past couple of years. Raja Koduri and Chris Hook being hired by Intel, several changes and improvements to their graphics control panel, plus multiple leaks, and it painted a pretty good picture of what Intel were planning. And it makes sense when you look at the broader ecosystem of computing. HPC in particular is no longer reliant on simply high core count CPUs. While of course they have their place, things such as machine learning and data analysis require the massive parallel throughput of modern day GPUs. And look at PC gaming. In 2018 alone, it was worth over $30 billion US, with gamers clamoring to purchase the latest and greatest GPUs capable of not only higher frame rates than ever before, but with better visual quality than what a console can muster. For gamers who demand ever-increasing visual quality, they are the reason that GPUs have become as powerful as what they are. And so, because of this symbiotic relationship, we now have very similar technology between data center GPUs as well as the GPUs that you will find in your desktop, mobile device, or even the GPU that's in, say, the next generation PlayStation. Therefore, Intel not having a range of discrete GPUs is literally leaving billions upon billions of US dollars on the table. My name's Paul, and in this GameInsider.com video, we're going to be taking a look at the Generation 11 graphics architecture from Intel, and then moving over to Intel Xe, which is the company's upcoming discrete range of GPUs. Do know though, before we proceed, Intel did pay for my flight and accommodation at GDC 2019, so that I could attend not only the GDC conference, but also the Odyssey event. Although my flight and accommodation was paid for, I was not paid to attend the event itself, and all opinions are my own. I was free to do whatever I wanted while at GDC. I could even attend competitor conferences if I wanted, and I have not been given talking points for these videos. In other words, all opinions are my own. In fact, number of Intel representatives have actually reached out since and have encouraged me to express my honest opinions as well as provide them feedback of what I think of their announcements thus far. So before we dive into the architecture, let's get some definitions out of the way and set a little groundwork. What is an iGPU versus a discrete GPU? An iGPU is integrated directly into the die of another processor, let's say the i9-9900K. So you have the CPU cores on die, plus the CPU caches, memory controllers and other bits, which of course are required for the chip to function. But there's also a chunk of silicon used up by the graphics solution. That would be of course the iGPU. A discrete GPU is different, and will generally be connected to the system via a PCIe slot on the motherboard. The discrete GPU resides therefore in its own PCB, typically shrouded by a hefty cooler and has its own memory, so it doesn't need to use system memory, although it can access it via the PCIe bus. Intel's discrete GPU will launch after Generation 11 and, to be clear, doesn't use the same architecture. More on that in a moment. Intel aren't officially confirming release dates, but have alluded to 2020 being the launch window. But that could of course mean January 1st or even December 31st for all we know. So let's have an overview of the Generation 11 graphics so we can see where the company is at so far. I'll link the architecture white paper down below and also a slideshow you can check out for the graphics optimization strategy. But those images will be used throughout this video. I will not be going super in-depth into all of the architecture. It's outside the scope of this video and would just take way too long. Instead, what we're going to do is have an overview of how Generation 11 works, and more importantly, how it differs and is more efficient than the older Gen architecture. We can then discuss Intel Xe with more confidence. Starting at the basics, the Gen 11 architecture will be built, like say the rest of Ice Link, on Intel's 10nm process. The highest end Gen 11 SKU will have 64 execution units, which offers a theoretical 2.67 times 1 performance increase over the older Gen 9 hardware. The architecture is considerably more efficient too. We'll get into how in just a moment. As mentioned earlier, The iGPU sits on the same physical die as the CPU cores, and as such, the SOC's ring interconnect ties the onboard GPU, CPU, and caches to both memory controllers and other components, which is via the PCIe bus. On the Gen 11 GT2, the SKU that's being discussed so far, we have a single slice that is further broken into sub-slices, but also contains other logics such as level 3 cache, geometry processing, and there's also a slice common, which houses things such as ROPs and other pixel processing. Each sub-slice is composed of 8 execution units, EUs, which allows for both SMT, simultaneous multi-threading, and also IMT, which means interleaved multi-threading. Each execution unit contains 2 SIMD units which support up to 4 floating point integer computation instructions assuming normal precision, or 8 16-bit operations per clock cycle. The execution unit's job is to do math. After all, math and computers kind of go hand in hand. Each EU runs up to 7 threads because operations can take varying amounts of time to complete, i.e. latency. So pipelining operations and keeping things running as parallel as possible is important. Because of the highest end SKU of Generation 11 is 64 execution units, this means the GPU can manage up to 448 threads, in theory. Each shader operation essentially runs on its own thread, and each of these threads require its own memory too, which is held in a register. If you're wondering why the number 7 for the number of threads, it's because the architects over at Intel claim it's the best for overall efficiency, and this hasn't changed from the jump from Gen 9 or Gen 9.5 to Gen 11. Intel have wisely implemented several new technologies for the Generation 11 architecture, the first of which is Coarse pixel shading, and if it's of any help, it's very similar to Nvidia's variable rate shading in functionality, although Intel did first demo Coarse pixel shading back in 2014. In a nutshell, it allows developers to set specific parts of the scene to be shaded at lower rates compared to the rest of the scene. So, for example, if a particular element on screen is subjected to lots of motion blur, perhaps in your peripheral vision, or just at a further distance or whatever other flags developers choose, it can be rendered at a lower quality. According to Intel anyway, this increases performance by about 30%-ish on average. On the hardware side of things, Intel are supporting Tier 2, which is foveated mode, but so far this is not implemented onto the software side of the stack. But apparently Intel is looking into it and are currently taking feedback from developers. There are a couple of different ways you can implement foveated rendering. The first is using an eye tracker in a VR headset. The eye tracker tracks the fovea centralis, which is a densely packed region of cones which are located in your iris. The headset and software can then figure out what's falling in your peripheral vision and reduce the quality of those regions accordingly. Then there's the other method which was discussed at GDC 2019 presentation. This is known as masked-based foveated rendering, or MBFR. It is independent to IHV extensions, and essentially a mask can be applied to an image to pretty much do the same thing as above, but instead, depending on how the mask falls on the image, this will dictate the rate of shading. It's also worth noting that Intel have filed a patent in January of this year, 2019. Its title is Super Resolution Based Foveated Rendering. According to the patent, areas of interest can be rendered at higher quality. Most curious. Intel also support positional tile-based rendering. PTBR is a pretty old technology, but is a great solution for low-power devices or bandwidth-strained scenarios. For example, ultra-low-power devices such as notebooks. PTBR is accomplished by Intel adding in a parallel geometry pipeline specifically designed for this purpose. This new pipeline is known as POSH, standing for Positional Only Shading, and it runs ahead of the traditional rendering pipeline. The GPU driver takes the vertex data and runs it through the POSH pipeline to calculate only the position. This can then be tested to see which triangles will and will not be visible, Anything that is obscured from view by either another object or simply rendered out of scene will be marked for be culled. The OVR, the Object Visibility Recorder, can then plonk this data back through the traditional rendering pipeline on a per-tile basis. It does this by writing it to memory. The visibility info can then be used through the normal rendering pipeline. There are limitations with PTBR though, particularly with high bandwidth render passes such as MSAA. So things such as D3D geometry shading, and also doesn't support compute shading while using these high bandwidth render passes. Simply because of bandwidth limitations, I suspect this will be less of an issue with the next generation of discrete GPUs though. Speaking of memory bandwidth is always a concern, and not just for the internal bits of the GPU such as moving data around caches, but also system memory, given not only does the IGPU need to use it, but also the CPU as well. To help alleviate this, Intel have bumped up the level 3 cache to 3 megabytes from just 768 kilobytes, and similar jumps for other memory including shared local memory as well as registers. Intel have also pulled towards a more unified architecture for memory as well. This is critical for usage of devices with low power envelopes and slower memory. It allows the CPU and GPU to access the same memory space, instead of requiring a copy of data from one memory portion to another memory portion. Intel have also confirmed they're supporting speeds up to DDR4 3733, along with faster low-power DDR4 as well, which have the obvious benefits. The takeaway here is Intel have worked in a lot of stuff from the previous generation, have tweaked it, improved it, and added a whole bunch of other stuff which seems to have worked. The Coarse pixel shading demo Intel had on display at their GDC booth was impressive enough. But we also have the less official leaks in performance. There have already been a few leaks of the benchmarks for Generation 11 graphics, with the low-power Gen 11 variant we've seen proving more than a match for AMD's Vega GPUs, which can be found in the Ryzen 7 2700U. An impressive feat to be sure, and given the drive is still yet to be finished and hardware isn't final, that tells us there is some room still left for improvement. This low-power Ice Lake processor with a quad CPU cores reporting a fairly meager 1.3 GHz base clock beats Intel's own UHD Graphics 630, which is found in the likes of the i7 8700. So enough about Generation 11, let's move over to Intel Xe. What is its performance targets? What about pricing? That type of stuff. Well, Intel themselves are being very cagey with certain information for Intel Xe. We do have some official information from the company that we will of course be going through, as well as several leaks, as well as some speculation on my part. Let's start things out with official info though, because there are a few nice clues Intel have provided us, the first of which is the Odyssey event itself. Intel have made a big deal of their 50 years of innovation recently, and they echoed this throughout the Odyssey event. Intel are keen to push the message that they are trying to change as a company, but this will be a multi-year journey for them. You've likely seen the various concept images of the Intel Xe, but it's imperative for you to know that these images are not created by Intel, but from Cristiano Sequeira, a designer and 3D artist who produced them in his own time. So the actual design of the cards might look radically different to these pieces of cool concept art. It's evidence though they are targeting all segments of the market through their GPU IP scalability image, and they did show this quite early on, but with the Odyssey event targeting both gamers and professional users as well, and also showing the recent changes to the control panel and graphics drivers, plus during the time of GDC there was also the announcement of them securing the Aurora supercomputer contract. Therefore, it will most likely be aimed at gamers, but also be very competitive in the area of HPC, and it's clear that Intel are attempting to push the scalability of Intel Xe architecture. The Xe was originally known as Arctic Sound, with Jupiter Sound being its successor. As you can imagine, we basically know nothing of Jupiter Sound, or I guess you could also call it Intel Xe2. Then there are a series of leaks from Ashraf over at the Motley Fool, and he posted several leaks which were very interesting on Twitter, which are no longer accessible due to account changes. Ashraf has been accurate in the past, and it's very important for us to realise that the leaks he posted in this series of tweets have come true, including the announcement of Foveros, as well as other key announcements on deep learning and ASICs. So what did Ashraf tell us? Well, Ashraf claims that the original Intel Xe had been designed around the idea of video acceleration and the cloud. But with Raja Koduri's arrival at Intel, this changed. We now have two distinctive usage scenarios. The first being cloud, compute, deep learning, and the other being, let's say, gaming. The Pro Intel Xe is said to be launching at a target of market leadership, in other words, beating Nvidia's own power to performance ratio. Apparently the GPUs will be built using chiplets in an MCP type of configuration. The number of these chiplets are said to be between 2 to 4, depending on the purpose/performance targets of the GPU. Chiplets and its approach isn't surprising. We've seen Intel demonstrate much of their packaging and 3D stacking capabilities with both EMIB and Foveros, and even Nvidia have been exploring similar designs, the company developing the RC18, or Research Chip 2018 if you prefer. This is a prototype chip designed for deep learning, using the company's current TSMC 16nm process, and AMD and chiplets have been synonymous. So the industry moving towards a different philosophy makes sense in the grander scheme of things. Nvidia's own research team published a report to this effect back in July of 2017. For Nvidia's team, they found the primary bottleneck was inter-GPU bandwidth, but with the correct optimization and solutions, an MCM GPU with 256 SM streaming multiprocessors offers a 45.5% higher performance than a single monolithic die, which contained just 128 SMs. Notice that bandwidth, latency, and inter-GPU communications were the biggest obstacles. Nvidia and AMD have said to be working on their own solutions, of course, but so have Intel, and it's hard to argue that the company's packaging and memory technologies plus CXL make for intriguing prospects. A complete analysis of CXL is outside the scope of this video, but the gist of the technology is it's designed for coherent memory pools and low latency, while leveraging PCIe 5.0 as its backbone. To keep things simple here, it's got three basic modes of operation. The first is CXL.io, which operates much like standard PCIe 5.0. The second is CXL.cache, which allows accelerators such as GPUs and FPGAs to access the CPU's cache. To be clear here, with .cache, the accelerator is always the one requesting the data, while the CPU will provide it. Lastly, we have CXL.memory, which plays the old switcheroo, with the CPU requesting the data directly from the GPU, for example, local memory. In theory, this allows devices using this protocol to seamlessly access data from another device pool, or RAM, and should be great for things such as data centers. It could also be used as an extension for games as well, allowing GPUs to work together with greater performance than ever before. Unfortunately, the reality is how this would work, it's unknown. Back when SLI and Crossfire were more widely supported, it was because DX11 pretty much handled all of the work, with game profiles being created which allow the driver magic to handle the grunt work. DX12, technically speaking, is more capable with MGPU, explicit multi-adapter. For example, you can run a Intel IGPU with a Nvidia GPU, or Nvidia and AMD together. Plus, it just can be faster, and some developers have managed impressive scaling using DX12, such as Ashes of the Singularity and even Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but it requires way more effort. So how Intel could fix these issues with some type of multi-GPU solution and CXL isn't known. It's possible that their own drivers and hardware could essentially act like the two GPUs or an even larger pool of resources physically. I guess you could think of it as a multi-GPU, as we've just discussed before, with the multi-dies on a GPU, but instead it's being spread over two physical GPU PCBs. But how they'd achieve this via software and hardware, particularly given the to-the-metal nature of DX12 and Vulkan, it's just pure speculation. Given the cost of modern GPUs, asking users to plonk 2 cards into their system for gaming has always been a tall order. Gone are the days where accelerators such as the Voodoo 2 were cheap enough to consider adding 2 in SLI for the vast majority of users. Thus, users who'd consider multi-GPU setups are certainly smaller. But for the data center, which is the scenario Intel are clearly marketing CXL towards right now, well, it could be an incredibly powerful technology, combined with higher core count processors, as well as the company's persistent Optane memory, which plugs into DDR4 slots of the boards, and is announced up to 512GB in capacity thus far. So what challenges does Intel face while entering the discrete GPU market? Well, obviously Intel does have an abundance of resources and have hired the right people. They have not only their original team of engineers, but they've also hired a whole bunch of additional engineers to help the design of the GPUs, plus other key people such as Raja Koduri, Chris Hook. We've seen Heather Lennon, Tom Peterson, Kyle Bennett, and a number of other key industry figures that have jumped ship to Intel. All of this is good news, but with that said, Raja Koduri and his team are breaking new ground over at Intel. So for the most part, a lot of it is uncharted territory when it comes to entering the discrete GPU market, at least for Intel as a company. Keeping the business side of things for a moment, there are a few ways a new competitor can compete against established rivals. The first is the simplest. Put out a product which simply outperforms the alternative and established offerings while being competitive price-wise. The second option is also pretty simple. Be competitive, but also cheaper than your competition. And the final way is to simply outmarket them. Intel are stepping into an arena with 2 very established rivals, and high-performance computing and Nvidia have been best buddies over the past several years. Nvidia's CUDA came to the market back in mid-2007, and since then it's gone through its infancy and strength to strength. Intel and AMD will be fighting to wrangle market share from Nvidia, and both companies are working on software stacks to allow developers to make the migration as seamless as possible. And we also have one API from Intel as well. Fortunately for all 3 vendors in the high-performance computing space, there's more than enough market to go around. And the ever-increasing need for high performance for cloud, analytics, deep learning, video streaming, game streaming, and it's only going to increase in the foreseeable future. Intel and AMD do have one advantage too. They can offer extremely custom hardware solutions for high-performance computing market, thanks to them creating the CPUs and platforms. And it'll be very interesting to see how Nvidia respond in the long term to both Team Red and Team Blue vying to nibble at their monopoly, assuming, of course, AMD or Intel can produce competitive data center products. For gaming, Nvidia currently clearly has the monopoly. We're all waiting for AMD to release Navi, but in the meantime, AMD have to deal with the onslaught of Turing, and at multiple price points with the RTX and the GTX series of GPUs. It's unclear if Intel will work with AIBs such as Asus, MSI, Gigabyte to create cards based on their chips, like say how AMD or Nvidia operate, or if Intel will release their cards on their own, like say CPUs or SSDs, or if we'll see AIB variants and also a Founders Edition like card from the company, a reference design if you will. What matters to gamers ultimately is performance and stability versus the amount of cash they're being asked to fork over. And 2020 is shaping up to be a particularly interesting year, because it's also when the next generation consoles are expected to launch, and we can presume, based on leaks and just, pure common sense, that these consoles will be a significant leap forward in performance over the current generation systems. Given the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro's existence though, we're just going to be curious on how capable they actually are. While every console sold does help AMD shift APUs, as are all but confirmed to be the partners for both Sony and Microsoft's hardware manufacturing, AMD along with Intel and Nvidia will still be keen, as well you can imagine, to sell graphics cards, and frankly the majority of gamers find it hard to justify from either financial or a simple moral point of view $1,000 plus on a high-end card. As I said, AMD are all but confirmed for the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Scarlet. So this is definitely a major positive for AMD because developers have little choice but to become familiar with the architecture of their graphics cards because of its prevalence in consoles. Therefore, game optimizations are definitely a sure thing for AMD and Nvidia. But Intel are not out of the loop, far from it. Intel have been very active recently engaging with the development community, hosting several sessions at GDC 2019, for example. Their driver team, headed by Lisa Pierce, has done a great job redesigning drivers, and they're currently doing their best to communicate with their developers so the software is optimized for Gen 9 and Gen 11 hardware, and we can only presume the efforts will increase when Xe launches. Whether this is successful or not with Xe remains to be seen. Unoptimized or buggy performance, such as say a missing texture or unstable drivers, will kill any momentum for Intel, and they are aware of this of course. Users will be watching with a keen eye. Intel have also ramped up advertising on social media, bundling games with Intel processors, pushing marketing towards gamers. Intel do not want to be seen by gamers, content creators and prosumers as a company which you can just buy your CPU from and maybe an SSD. Intel's job right now is to work on consumer mindshare, ensure that not only is there a large enough swathe of consumers excited for Intel Xe's potential, but also think of Intel as not just a CPU company. During the Odyssey event, Raja Koduri asked the 1,000 or so people who attended the event, there were actually far more who RSVP'd, but quite a number of them had to be turned away simply because of the size of the venue. And he asked them several things. One is, what challenges do you face right now? 2, what do you expect out of a GPU? And 3, how can we help you achieve what you want? Be it if you're a gamer, if you're a content producer, if you're a prosumer, and so on. And he wasn't just asking in terms of like, how do we make the frame rates better? He was actually asking, what challenges do you face and how can we improve things either on the software side of things or in terms of the physical architecture? I guess where I'm going with this is that Intel are keenly aware that in a year or so, customers will be faced with a choice. A customer will be stood in a store, let's pretend it's a brick and mortar store for this particular video because it just sounds more epic, and they will be staring at several manufacturers of GPU, AMD, Nvidia, and of course Intel. And no matter what the price point the customer is comfortable paying, that customer has to be convinced to leave the AMD GPU and the Nvidia GPUs on the store shelves and instead walk away with Intel's own card. This brings up an inevitable question: can they be successful in doing this? And the answer, of course, is that we simply don't know yet. Tune back in a year or so's time, I guess, and we can certainly have a good understanding of the answer. So one of my final thoughts to this, I am personally excited of Intel jumping into the discrete GPU arena, for much the same reason that I was very happy for AMD to be competitive in the CPU side of things and for Nave to hopefully take the fight to Nvidia. Competition is always a good thing, so hopefully with more choice in the market, we as consumers can benefit. Currently, we're in a binary system. If AMD fumbles, we're at the mercy of Nvidia. If Nvidia fumbles, we're at the mercy of AMD. And both companies have released products that did not quite hit the mark. For example, back in the days of the GTX 480 in Fermi, it's not that the 480, for example, was a bad card, but it's hard to argue that it was power hungry and, well, put out a whole bunch of heat. And then we had, if we go even further back, the 8800 Ultra and other series of GPUs that essentially got rebranded multiple times with, let's say, the 9000 series. Nvidia just were not quite hitting the mark there. And then, of course, we have the RTX series of GPUs, which we can all agree was just very expensive when it's launched. And it's not like AMD are much better. They've also had a couple of GPUs that just did not quite hit the mark. So I guess where I'm going with this is having more competition in the market is only going to be a good thing. Hopefully. Back in the 90s, we had a lot of competition in the 3D space, with companies such as ATI, now owned by AMD of course, 3DFX, gobbled by Nvidia, after 3DFX made baffling decisions. Nvidia, S3 and its Savage line of cards, Power VR, and plus several are missing. Getting back to what I said about Navi earlier, the reason Navi is so exciting is because if the rumours are true, RTX 2070 performance for around $300, it drastically upsets the market conditions we've seen from a price performance standpoint. Heck, even if the pricing is inaccurate and it's $400, it's still a great alternative to Nvidia. Intel entering the discrete GPU market is very interesting because in a best case scenario anyway, it pushes both AMD and Nvidia to be on top of their game, if you excuse the pun. In fact, it could also mean that if iGPUs become more powerful, classes of cards such as, let's say, the GTX 1050 or the GTX 1650 become pointless because the iGPU is just as capable as those discrete GPUs. To repeat myself once again, only time can tell if Intel are successful in doing this. Personally, I am cautiously optimistic of Intel entering the discrete GPU market. Naturally, we're going to have to wait for the GPUs to be released so we can see how they perform against their competitors. My advice to you as an end user is to do just that. Wait for reviews. But in the meanwhile, contact these companies like Nvidia, AMD and Intel via social media. Tell them what you want from your product. And we can only wait and see how the market changes over the next 12 to 24 months. With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you did, well, you know what to do. Like, share, comment and subscribe. You can also find us down below on the social medias as well as Patreon. And of course, you can also find some Amazon affiliate links. With all of that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.